What happens when Chisholm, a young woman sold like cattle to save her family's name, is forced to marry Divine Ago, a ruthless billionaire confined to a wheelchair who sees marriage as nothing more than a cold business deal? Will her innocence melt his heart of stone? Or will his arrogance crush what little hope she has left? And what secret does the crippled CEO hide behind closed doors that change everything after their first night together? If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family. And tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The early morning sun streamed weakly through the cracked windows of the small servant's room, casting a faint light over the peeling wallpaper and the worn-out mattress on the floor. In this forgotten corner of the Omafuma estate lived Chisholm, the true heir to a fortune she was no longer allowed to touch. As she tied her threadbare apron, her mind drifted to the past, to a time when her mother, Mercy Omafuma, was the pride of the business world and Chisholm was treated like a princess. But since Mercy's tragic death, that world had crumbled. Her father, Solomon, had remarried Justina, a woman whose heart was made of stone despite her sweet perfume. Chisholm, the kitchen is filthy. Move your lazy feet. Justina's shrill voice cut through the air like a whip. Chisholm rushed down the narrow staircase, passing her stepsister, Melody, who lounged on an ornate sofa while scrolling through a brand-new phone. "Don't forget my laundry, servant girl," Melody sneered, tossing a balled-up sweater at Chisholm's feet. Chisholm picked it up without a word. She had learned that silence was her only shield. From the kitchen, she could hear Justina mocking her to Solomon, calling her a charity case, while her father remained painfully silent. Meanwhile, across Lagos in a towering skyscraper, Divine Ago stared out of his floor-to-ceiling penthouse windows. His empire, hotels, tech, and real estate, was vast, yet he stood as a broken legend. 2 years after a car accident left him partially paralyzed and wheelchair-bound, he had retreated into a life of cold isolation. He was powerful and untouchable to the world, but inside, he was utterly alone. As he sipped his whiskey, a plan was forming, a contract marriage that required no love, only a transaction. He was ready to claim what he needed, unaware that his path was already hurtling toward the girl currently scrubbing floors in the shadows of the Omafuma mansion. Solomon Omafuma sat in his private study, the air thick with the scent of old paper and desperation. Piles of unpaid bills, foreclosure notices, and threatening letters from the bank littered his mahogany desk like the debris of a shipwreck. His once thriving business empire, a tapestry of real estate and oil contracts, was unraveling faster than he could stitch it back together. The whispers on the streets of Lagos were growing louder, mocking the Omafuma name as a hollow shell. The heavy door creaked open as Justina sauntered in, her silk robe trailing behind her like a predator's tail. Behind her, Melody lounged against the doorframe, her eyes glued to a new designer handbag she had purchased on credit they no longer possessed. "We are finished," Solomon croaked, dropping a thick legal file onto the table with a dull thud. "If we don't find an investor immediately, the house, the cars, our very names will be gone." Justina didn't flinch. She set her wine glass down and leaned over the desk, her eyes glinting with a cold, calculated light. "There is one man powerful enough to rescue us," she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to Solomon's defeat. "Divine Ago." Solomon shuddered at the name. Divine was a kingmaker, but a reclusive and ruthless one since his accident. "Isn't he crippled?" Melody asked, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "Who cares?" Justina snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "He is rich beyond measure, and he is looking for a wife to secure his public image." "You're suggesting one of our daughters marry him?" Solomon asked, his voice trembling. Justina's smile was like a blade. "Not our daughters, Solomon. Just Chisholm." "Thank God," Melody sighed in mock relief. "She's just a child," Solomon pleaded weakly, though the greed in his heart was already beginning to stifle his conscience. "She's 18. "She's useful," Justina countered, her heart of stone showing no mercy. "She isn't even blood. Let her pay back the years of charity we've wasted on her." Solomon looked away, his silence sealing his daughter's fate. The heavy silence of the study followed Solomon out into the hallway, but it was Justina's sharp, triumphant voice that shattered the peace of the kitchen where Chisholm was finishing the evening dishes. "Chisholm, come here," she commanded, her voice dripping with a false saccharine sweetness that made the hair on Chisholm's neck stand up. Chisholm wiped her damp hands on her threadbare apron and stepped into the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Solomon was there, slumped in his favorite armchair, but he looked smaller, diminished by the weight of the secret he held. He stared fixedly at a spot on the floor, his hands gripped so tightly that his knuckles were white. "We have wonderful news, dear," Justina said, her eyes gleaming like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "You're getting married." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Chisholm felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold. "Married?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "To whom?" "Papa, what is she saying?" Solomon didn't move. He didn't look up. He remained a statue of cowardice as Justina continued, to divine Ago. "A man of immense wealth and power. You should be grateful. He's saving this family from total ruin." "But I don't even know him," Chisholm pleaded, her eyes searching her father's face for a glimmer of the man who used to call her his princess. "Papa, please. I want to stay here. I want to finish my studies." Finally, Solomon spoke, but his voice was a hollow rasp, and his eyes never once met hers. "It is decided, Chisholm. It is the only way." He stood up abruptly, his gaze still fixed on the wall behind her, and walked out of the room as if she were already a ghost. "Start packing," Justina sneered, the mask of sweetness finally dropping. "The wedding is in a week. Try not to look so miserable, you're finally going to be useful for something." Left alone in the dim light, Chisholm realized she wasn't just being married off, she was being traded away to a lion, and her own father had opened the cage. The morning of the wedding arrived with none of the fanfare Chisholm had once dreamed of. Instead of a celebration of love, the atmosphere in the Omafoma household was thick with the suffocating silence of a funeral. Chisholm stood before her cracked mirror, draped in a faded ivory lace gown that had been pulled from the back of Justina's closet. It was too large, smelling of mothballs and neglected years, yet no one had bothered to adjust a single stitch. She felt like a ghost inhabiting someone else's life. The ceremony took place in a sterile community hall on the outskirts of Lagos, far removed from the glittering ballrooms of the elite. There were no flowers, no music, and no warmth. Divine Ago was wheeled into the hall by two stone-faced bodyguards, looking every bit the ruthless titan the tabloids described. Clad in a sharp, dark green agbada that contrasted with the clinical white of his wheelchair, he was a statue of power and cold authority. He did not spare a single glance for the trembling girl who was brought to stand beside him. His face was a mask of unreadable granite, eyes fixed forward as if this were merely a board meeting to be endured. When the time came for the vows, Chisholm's voice was a fragile whisper, cracking under the weight of her humiliation. The officiant had to prompt her twice before she could force the words "I do" past her constricted throat. In contrast, Divine's response was firm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. The signing of the marriage register felt more like the execution of a death warrant than a covenant. No rings were exchanged with tenderness, and no kiss followed the pronouncement. As the ink dried on the contract, Justina and Solomon looked on with visible relief, their debts finally paid with the currency of their daughter's freedom. To the world, they were now husband and wife, but as Chisholm was led toward the waiting black SUV, she knew she was nothing more than a purchased asset in a house of shadows. The black iron gates of the Ago estate swung open with a silent, mechanical precision that made Chisholm's heart tighten. As the SUV rolled up the long driveway, lined with towering palm trees and marble fountains that danced under the moonlight, the sheer scale of the mansion came into view. It was a modern palace of glass and steel, beautiful and imposing, but to Chisholm, it felt like a fortress designed to keep the world out. When the car came to a stop, a team of staff in crisp uniforms appeared instantly. They bowed with practiced respect as the bodyguards expertly transitioned Divine from the car into his wheelchair. Chisholm stepped out slowly, her fingers aching from how tightly she gripped her small battered suitcase against her chest. She felt like a stain on the perfect marble of the driveway. Divine finally turned his head, his cold, dark eyes sweeping over her with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting a new piece of furniture. "You will live here now," he said, his voice deep and cutting through the evening air like a blade. "You will have your own room. You will follow the house rules, and above all, you will respect my privacy. My quarters are off limits unless I summon you." Without waiting for a response, he wheeled himself toward the grand entrance, his movements swift and efficient, leaving her standing alone in the wind. The heavy thud of her heart was the only sound until a gentle hand touched her arm. "This way, madam," a soft voice whispered. It was Mama Ada, an older woman with kind eyes that offered the first spark of warmth Chisholm had felt in years. As she led Chisholm through the echoing museum-like halls to a sprawling guest room on the second floor, the housekeeper leaned in close. "Master Divine has a heavy spirit, but do not let the silence of this house frighten you." Left alone in the opulence of her new room, Chisholm sat on the edge of the velvet-soft bed. The luxury was suffocating. She was surrounded by gold and glass, yet as the heavy doors of the mansion remained shut, she realized she had simply traded one prison for another. The days in the Ago mansion bled into weeks, a seamless cycle of luxury and crushing silence. Chisholm lived like a ghost, her presence barely rippling the surface of the household's clockwork precision. She occupied a room that was a masterpiece of velvet and gold, yet she felt more like an ornamental statue than a wife. Divine remained a shadow in his own home, sequestered in his ground-floor study or behind the soundproof doors of his private quarters. When they did cross paths in the grand hallways, his gaze remained fixed forward, his face a cold, unreadable mask of marble. He never touched her, never summoned her, and never acknowledged the hollow wedding ring that felt like a lead weight on her finger. To the world, she was the bride of a billionaire. To Divine, she was merely a line item in a ledger, a debt settled, a contract fulfilled. The loneliness was a different kind of pain than the overt abuse of the Omafuma house. Here she wasn't hated, she was simply non-existent. However, the veil of her invisibility began to tear late one evening. Passing by the half-open door of the private gym, Chisholm stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, the untouchable Divine Ago was alone, away from the prying eyes of his assistants. The sleek, powerful seer was struggling, his knuckles white as he gripped the bars of a weight bench, trying to maneuver his weight with a strained, agonizing effort. The cold mask had slipped, revealing a face etched with raw frustration and a deep, simmering bitterness. She watched from the shadows as he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his chest heaving with the exertion of a body that refused to obey his brilliant mind. In that moment, the ruthless Cripple disappeared. In his place was a man fighting a solitary war against his own skin. For the first time, Chisholm didn't see a captor or a master. She saw a soul as trapped and wounded as her own. The golden hues of the setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges. Chisholm stood on the wide marble balcony of her room, the cool evening breeze tugging at the hem of her simple dress. She leaned against the cold stone railing, watching the shadows of the palm trees stretch like long dark fingers across the manicured lawns. The silence of the Ago mansion usually felt like a weight, but tonight, it felt like a fuse waiting to be lit. The rhythmic, mechanical sound of wheels against the floor announced his arrival before he spoke. Divine rolled into the space, stopping a few feet away, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves. "Are you adjusting to your new life?" Divine finally asked, his voice deep and devoid of warmth. It was the same tone he used for board meetings, a tone that treated her like a line item on a ledger. Chisholm didn't turn around. "Is that what you call this, Divine? A life?" He arched an eyebrow, his jaw tightening. "You have everything you could ask for. Luxury, security, a name that commands respect. You are free to move as you wish within these walls." "Free?" Chisholm turned then, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "I am a prisoner in a golden cage, and you are the one holding the key. You look at me and see a business acquisition, a debt paid in flesh and blood. You bought me from a father who didn't want me, and now you store me here like a piece of expensive furniture." Divine's dark eyes narrowed. "It was a contract, Chisholm. One that saved your family from the streets." "I am not a contract," she shot back, her voice cracking with the weight of weeks of suppressed pain. "I am a person with a heart that beats and a soul that feels. You hide behind your wheelchair and your cold rules because you're terrified of seeing me as anything other than a transaction. But I am here, Divine. I am real. And I refuse to be invisible anymore." The air between them grew heavy, charged with a sudden, electric tension. For the first time, Divine didn't look away. He stared at her, the mask of the ruthless CEO slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of raw, startled vulnerability. In that moment, the ice didn't just crack, it began to shatter. The clinical silence of the Aggo Mansion's private gym was broken only by the rhythmic hum of a heart rate monitor and the soft rustle of Chisholm's movements. For weeks, they had lived like ghosts in the same corridors, but today, the wall of professional distance finally crumbled. Divine sat on the edge of the massage table, his torso bare, eyes fixed stubbornly on the gardens outside. He looked like a fallen god, powerful, broad-shouldered, and yet tethered to a body that refused to obey him. Chisholm approached tentatively, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached for the bottle of warmed therapeutic oil, her fingers trembling as she poured a small amount into her palms. When she finally stepped into his personal space, the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an invisible current. As her hands made first contact with the small of his back, Divine flinched, his muscles coiling under her touch. The heat radiating from his skin was startling. She began to knead the stiff muscles of his lower back, her movements slow and deliberate, just as the therapist had instructed. With every stroke, the electric tension intensified. She could feel the raw strength beneath his skin, a sharp contrast to the vulnerability of his stillness. Divine let out a low, ragged breath, his head dropping forward. The sound sent a shiver down Chisholm's spine. For the first time, she wasn't just a sacrificial bride or a servant, she was the one providing the strength he lacked. Her thumbs traced the line of his spine, and for a fleeting second, his hand reached back, his fingers brushing against her wrist. The contact was brief, but it scorched. Neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with the weight of things unsaid. In that small, humid room, the transaction of their marriage began to dissolve, replaced by a simmering, undeniable need that made Chisholm's breath catch in her throat. The crippled billionaire wasn't the only one being healed. In his proximity, Chisholm felt her own frozen heart begin to thaw. The air in Divine's master suite was thick with the scent of sandalwood and a tension that had been simmering for weeks. Chisholm stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the moonlight casting a silver glow over her skin, while the soft whir of Divine's wheelchair broke the heavy silence. For the first time, the cold, calculated mask he wore as a shield was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made Chisholm's heart hammer against her ribs. He watched her, his dark eyes no longer reflecting the steel of a CEO, but the hunger of a man who had long forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "I told myself this was just a transaction," Divine said, his voice a low, gravelly confession that vibrated through the quiet room. "A way to fix a broken image. But every time you touch me, every time you look at me without pity, the walls I built start to crumble." He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against her wrist. The contact was electric, a spark that ignited a fire Chisholm had tried to suppress since the day they wed. In that moment, the crippled billionaire the world whispered about vanished. As he pulled her closer, the physical limitations that had once defined their distance seemed to evaporate in the heat of their shared breath. Divine let his guard down completely, allowing Chisholm to see the wounded soul beneath the power, and in return, he claimed her with a fierce, possessive tenderness. As the night unfolded, Chisholm's fears were replaced by a staggering realization. This wasn't the hollow duty she had prepared for, it was an awakening. Behind closed doors, Divine was powerful in ways she had never imagined, his touch commanding and his devotion absolute. When morning light finally touched the room, Chisholm didn't feel like a sacrificial bride or a bartered pawn. She looked at the man sleeping beside her and felt a surge of unexpected, triumphant joy. The contract was dead. In its place was a bond forged in passion, and for the first time in her life, Chisholm rejoiced in the fate that had brought her to his bed.